This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Ron Rohde, Kentucky Afield's first host back in 1953. Now, I'm proud to present Charlie Baglin.
Allergy sufferers, it's spring season. And for a bunch of us, it's also sneezing season. Hang in there with us for an hour, and we will endeavor to show you a different side of pollen and how healthy wildlife habitat thrives on what makes you and me sneeze. My guest this hour is Casey Schrader with the USDA and Pollinator Handbook author. Claritin ready as we go inside outdoors on this edition of Kentucky Afield Radio.
Did you grab the mayonnaise?
We've got to meet Bob and Cindy at the little store to buy some lunch stuff. Where's John?
He said he left something in his room. He's coming. Did you grab the mayonnaise?
What do you think? Ham, chips? I put that mustard we like in the cooler.
Did you grab the mayonnaise? Oh, here he comes.
Good. He grabbed his life jacket. I should have remembered that.
Did you grab the mayonnaise?
Cupcakes. I want those yellow cupcakes.
Tell your phone.
Boaters are busy, on and off the water. That's why Kentucky conservation officers remind you, your life jacket's got your back. For Mother's Day, how many moms would like to go fishing? What if I said, for Mother's Day, family time, real conversations?
Perfect.
That's more like it. And that's what happens when you fish. You catch up on life. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife says learn more about lakes near your family that are stocked and ready to hook memories this Mother's Day at fw.ky.gov. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin, and habitat is a word that for a goodly amount of people means woodlands, most likely, and maybe the adjacent fields. But habitats can be as various as the critters that use them. I'm talking with an expert today in the field of pollinator habitat. Probably a word you haven't heard, but it's habitat chances are you have right around your home. Casey Schrader from the USDA, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Charlie.
We're talking about pollinating habitats, a part of nature that we can thank immensely that helps agriculture crops. But pollinator habitat may be very well a new term on the lips of anybody listening to this program. How commonly do you hear people just talk about pollinator habitat? Is it rare or is it more common?
In the last 2 or 3 years especially, USDA has been greatly interested in pollinator habitat to the extent where we have started pollinator initiatives throughout the country worrying about the collapse or the demise of the European honeybee, which is responsible probably for most of the pollinating services that go on in crop production. It's been said that 1 out of probably every 4 mouthfuls of food that we consume is a direct or indirect result of pollination by a bee.
25% of the food we eat. We might as well back up and say, let me just ask you, pollination, that's the stuff that collects on our cars in April, that for a lot of people is an allergen. Pollination is something we have heard about probably from grade school. But what are the creatures that are pollinating, and what is the basic definition of pollination?
I'm one of those people that suffer from the pollen in the spring. But you have to remember that actually it's a very important process. The definition of pollination is just moving pollen from one part of a reproducing plant or the structures of a plant to another part or another flower. And that can be done by many different methods. It can be done by water. It can be done by wind. Or in most cases, it's done by another animal, namely bees, moths, butterflies, some birds. Hummingbird is an example. Although it's not a really important pollinator, it does provide some pollination services. And without that happening, the plants don't reproduce or produce seeds or fruits in which other wildlife or other critters use.
I've got to step in and say, I have seen this happen. I have seen bees on clover. I have seen hummingbirds go to native plants in the yard. And it just seems to me they are doing nothing more than recreating or feeding themselves. And if anything else is going on. Now, this is just me looking as a curious individual, that it's haphazard in nature at best in my sight, but there's a method to all of this.
Well, yes and no. There is a method, and the reason that bees are the workhorse of pollinators is because if you look very closely at all these animals I've mentioned, the vast majority have either a feather or hairs that the pollen actually collects on those animals, and they'll get very messy. In the case of bees, they're actually feeding on the pollen. That's all they eat. They eat pollen. So when they're going after pollen, it consequently gets all over them and haphazardly moves that pollen from one part of the plant to another part of the plant. As a result, you get reproduction of that plant by a seed or a berry, and plants perpetuated that way.
And that's the way nature intended. It's not just accidentally happening.
That's right. And a lot of these bee species and butterfly species that are doing the pollination have kind of evolved with those plants so that their body shape and size is particularly advantageous for them to be able to get into a specific flower or part of a plant.
I read that in your guide. Can you give me a showcase example of what that would be?
A really good example of that would be a bumblebee in a gentian plant or a squash bee in a squash plant. The squash bee have kind of co-evolved where the bee actually nests at the bottom of the plant, one of the members of the genus Cucurbitae. It will actually sleep in that plant sometimes. It pollinates that in a specific way as to make that plant produce squash. And it's the only effective pollinator for that particular plant.
We're talking to Casey Schrader, who is with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service. That's a lot of words, but he's a biologist and knows a lot about a lot of things we just take for granted. Flowering plants and creatures, the bees, the butterflies, the hummingbirds that visit them and perpetuate what we have come to enjoy every spring. Casey, I'm glad you're here. You have written a book that you emailed to me. I call it a book. It's a technical guide, and you are the author of that, a reference guide for pollinators and their habitat. When did you do this?
I was with NRCS out in West Virginia and for several years, and myself and the Xerxes Society for Macroinvertebrate Conservation and the West Virginia Division of Natural Resources, we did that about 2 years ago. We're hoping to provide the similar information for Kentucky. A lot of the information in the West Virginia Pollinator Handbook is extremely applicable to Kentucky, especially eastern and central Kentucky. But we'd like to have something a little more specific for the entire state of Kentucky, so we're actually working on another one.
I gathered that because Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia, we're all pretty much temperate states, and we have to have a lot of the same insects that visit our farms and fields.
That's exactly right. And a lot of the habitat that we spoke of earlier is available already in Kentucky. Kentucky has a wealth of habitat for pollinators. So this book would try to guide landowners and land managers, give them some sort of technical references on what landowners should look for, how should they enhance habitat or protect the habitat that they have.
We're going to spend a little while together on this show. In our next segment, maybe we could get into, let me just ask you, do you have to be a major landowner to establish pollinating habitat on your property? Is this something that can be done in your backyard that a neighborhood could do? Or do you have to be a farmer?
That's a good question. I get asked that a lot. Certainly, the principles for each of those scenarios that you just mentioned are the same. And you don't have to have huge tracts of land to establish pollinator habitat. Chances are most people have some habitat for pollinators already in their backyard. Small amounts of habitat scattered throughout an area are generally as good as large areas, depending on what you're targeting, what your intent.
Casey, I'll tell you this. I am as guilty as anyone as seeing something strictly in isolation. If a bee is on clover, I presume it's there for lunch. And watch your step if you're barefooted. Nothing more. But this is Kentucky Afield Radio. We have a duty to look behind the scenes and see how nature is interconnected. If a fourth of the food we eat is directly a result of pollination, let's find out what's on the menu.
Sounds great.
We'll do that when we come back. I'm Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Baglin, and we are talking about pollination. It is getting towards spring, and we have grown up by seeing birds and butterflies and bees bouncing from plant to plant, and we want to find out a little bit more about the science that surrounds all of that. I'm talking to Casey Schrader, who is with the Natural Resources Conservation Service with the USDA. And Casey, you had written for the state of West Virginia and for the U.S. Department of Agriculture a pollinator handbook, a technical guide. And I want to read just a caption from the introduction right here on page 1. And I think this sums it up. The work of bees and other pollinators is something that touches us all. It says that through the food we eat, the clothes we wear, the landscapes that we enjoy, pollinators have touched us all. And they are vital for agricultural systems. You've written here 35% of global crop production. I wasn't aware of that. What's interesting to me, down a little bit lower in the paragraph, is you get immediately into the dollar value. You say with the thousands of different insects out there at work for us in the pollination business, native bees contribute an estimated $3 billion worth of crop services to the U.S. economy every year. That is something. Casey, here we go. You had said early on in our first segment that 25% of the food we eat is due to pollinators' impact on croplands. What's that concept all about with bees and crops?
Bees provide pollination service for things such as, like I said, truck crops, berries, orchards, our fruit production. And when you think about all the products that are made from those types of crops, then you start really kind of getting the scope of how important pollination services are to agriculture.
What are those crops specifically?
Apples, pears, all of the fruit crops that we typically enjoy. We have berries, blueberries, most of our gourd crops, any kind of truck or commercial crops, watermelons, a lot of the things out, some of the vineyards, not all of them. So we start looking at beverages and fruits and vegetables, those types of crops that we eat and consume every day. And it's very important when you're talking about pollination services to understand that relationship between the insect and the flower.
That's interesting because little old me would have thought these are seeds, you plant them, and plants grow. Is that part of it? After they grow, are they dependent on pollinating insects to do the rest of the work?
That's right. If you think about something like the citrus crop in Florida, they are heavily dependent on pollination services from bees especially to actually produce the seed and the fruit. The seed is contained in the fruit. And those oranges that's basically the whole basis of their production is dependent on a bee to move that pollen from one part of the flower to another and produce that fruit.
And if there are no bees, what happens?
If there are no bees, then there probably are no oranges in the citrus industry, and that would be a bad move for them.
Bees, there's sort of a mixed bag with bees. And you can look at bees as if, the Honey Nut Cheerio bee. Oh, that's great. We love the birds and the bees. Busy as a bee. We can talk about bees in a number of ways, But the perception is bees are bad. Bees, at the end of the day, are going to sting you. We all remember as a kid stepping on one in the backyard. And granted, that's not fun. But that is very much the exception to what a bee is all about. And so a lot of people are not all warm and fuzzy about bees. But if you have these bees, you have good things to eat and drink.
And a word about native bees. You know, people kind of just lump bees into one large category. Any bee will sting under the right circumstances. But you have to remember that there's a difference between some of the bees that we have. People call bees, but they're really wasps and hornets, and then there are native bees, true native bees. Hornets and wasps that make paper or mud nests on the wall, or those are not significant pollinators. Now, that's not to say they shouldn't be indiscriminately destroyed, but they're not the type of insect that actually goes out and pollinates. They are fantastic predators of small, soft-bodied pest insects like aphids and things. So they do provide an ecological service. But native bees that we talk about are typically don't swarm, they don't attack, they're relatively harmless unless you happen to step on one or you know, catch one under your arm or something like that. Then they will sting.
I'm looking here at the guide that you wrote, and there's a quote in here. It says, insects and flowering plants diversified and evolved together, resulting in the most widespread occurrence of mutual interdependence in the natural world. That's your writing?
That's right.
That is something we would look at a plant, a flowering plant, and say, that's there on its own, the insect exists on its own, and they just happen to come together every now and then when the bee wants a drink of nectar. Not the case at all, is it?
It's not. Without that symbiotic relationship, the entire food web of the world would break down. Most of the plants, about 70% of them, are pollinated by another animal. So you would have about, if that symbiotic relationship didn't exist, 70% of the food web would just collapse. And when you think about that, that's amazing to me. It would cause a cascade effect, basically, on every other species' survival.
Put that into visual terms. Name a symbiotic relationship to where if one or the other left, and how that would affect different creatures and ultimately you and me down the line.
Can't relate it directly back to humans. I mean, it would be a more of a cumulative trickle-down type theory. If you didn't have the pollination service of insects, then what's going to happen is the food sources drastically dwindle, your availability of different foods. Things like corn and wheat and those types of things are wind pollinated, which it wouldn't have much of an effect, but most of the pollinating insects produce food in which other animals eat, like birds or wild game or turkey or the typical wildlife that we think of, then feeds on those fruits, which in turn, you know, another animal would feed on, which we would, you know, eventually get down to limiting our dietetic needs. So I guess in a way, you know, there's not one specific example that you could come up with, but it would be a cumulative effect on the whole food web.
What I'm thinking is pollinating habitat. I'm thinking has another name. Perhaps edge habitat. Are the two similar?
They are.
And I'm thinking about this where creatures such as bobwhite quail and cottontail rabbits may live, and a variety of songbirds. If that habitat goes away, then the food and shelter for other wildlife creatures also goes away.
That's exactly right. We talk about early successional habitat or old fields or edge habitat, the edge of forest areas that have started to grow up into weeds or or grass and forbs, those areas are vitally important to all the wildlife that you've talked about. In fact, some of the wildlife that we now are all worried about and concerned about the decline of is because of the lack of that habitat. And the great thing about that is, if there is a good thing, is that it's also important for pollinator habitat. And you know, I always joke that we're creating pollinator habitat. These bees and insects that actually do the pollinating work are actually the food for some of the things like bobwhite quail or wild turkey that we know and love and like to talk about when we talk about wildlife. So we're actually providing a food source for them while we're actually providing pollinator habitat.
Nature is definitely interconnected.
You can't pull one string of the web without pulling all the others.
I want to talk about what people can do, and this may be, again, something we've touched on, and landowners can do if this type of habitat is so beneficial to us visually and to the crops and is an important cog in the wheel, what we can do to improve these habitats, if that's to go out and create them or to improve them. I look forward to getting your advice in the next segment. Does that sound good?
Sounds great.
This is Kentucky Afield Radio. This is Kentucky Afield Radio. I'm Charlie Baglin into our second half hour. You've heard my voice on life jacket commercials across the state. If it has been a production of the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife for the past 25 years, I've either written it or voiced it. And it's my bet that it really hasn't made a world of difference. I hope it would have. Maybe it has. But do me this favor. You don't have to wear one. There's nothing in the law, unless you're skiing or being pulled by a rope, that says you have to wear one if you're an adult. But at least recognize the fact that kids under 12 do. And here's when. The reg reads, if you're under 12 years of age, you must wear a personal flotation device, a fancy way of saying a life jacket, that's in the open portion of a boat when that boat is underway. You have to wear one when skiing, when boarding, or being pulled by a rope of any nature. But my point here is for children. If you make sure that they wear their life jackets when they're supposed to, and they grow up to see the benefit, then maybe all the media efforts about wearing life jackets won't be necessary when they're grown up, because life jackets will just be second nature. And with a little luck, maybe all boaters can live to see that happen. It is time now for our fishing report.
This is Tom's your fishing report from the Northeast. Cave Run Lake is still way above summer pool, but the drawdown is underway. The only ramps that are currently usable are still Scotts Creek and Offer Ramp, so expect high boat traffic in these areas. The good news is that the water in the bushes and the trees along the lake edges is holding a lot of bass. I've heard reports of bass being caught on plastics and jigs in the shallow water. Grayson Lake is right at normal pool levels for this time of the year. Bass are shallow. Spinners, plastics, and jigs should work for you. Also hearing some good reports on the hybrids at Grayson. Several large fish are being caught. Focus in the Bruin area of the lake. Catfish stockings and hybrid sunfish stockings are getting ready to kick off on our Fins Lakes, and our May trout stockings will be starting next week. You can find out more about these stockings on our website, fw.ky.gov. That should do it for us in the Northeast. Wherever you go, good luck and stay safe.
This is Kevin Fry with your Eastern Area Fisheries Report. Most area lakes are back down to summer pool level and producing very good largemouth bass fishing. Catfish anglers reporting good catches with chicken liver or cut bait at Dewey and Carr Creek Lakes and shallow water shoreline areas. Remember, at Dewey and Fish Trap Lakes, there is a 15 fish limit on blue and channel catfish combined, with only one fish greater than 25 inches. Cool water temps have kept white bass in good numbers up in Johns Creek upstream of Dewey Lake. Reports of fish being caught on black or dark-colored plastic grub jigs. Trout tailwater stockings occurred this week at Buckhorn, Dewey, Painesville, and Yatesville lakes. Lakes clearing up and water temps rising. Bluegill and panfish reports will pick up. Don't forget the smaller lakes and ponds and area for good bluegill fishing.
Hi, this is Eric Cummins with your Southwest Kentucky Fishing Report. Barren River Lake is well above summer pool and is being drawn at about a half foot to a foot a day. Bass are scattered with some still hanging on main and secondary lake points. Green River Lake also has high discharge. Bass are scattered. Crappie have been mainly coming out of deeper structure and deeper brush. Small lake bass spawn is on at Metcalfe County Lake, Mill Creek Lake, Shaney Hollow, and Spurlington. Red ear and bluegill action has been good on smaller, shallower lakes like Briggs and West Fork drakes, and also on your farm ponds. Don't overlook small creeks and streams that feed into flooded Barren and Green rivers for some early season smallmouth and rock bass action. As always, good luck and good fishing. Your life jacket has your back.
Kentucky Afield Radio, weeds, thickets, brush. These are all ugly to you and me, but they are the Hollywood Hilton to Kentucky small animals. Back with more after the break. For Mother's Day, how many moms would like to go fishing? What if I said, for Mother's Day, family time, real conversations?
Perfect.
That's more like it. And that's what happens when you fish. You catch up on life. Kentucky Fish and Wildlife says learn more about lakes near your family that are stocked and ready to hook memories this Mother's Day at fw.ky.gov. You're listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. My name is Charlie Baglin. We are talking with an individual named Casey Schrader, and he's with the USDA and the NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, knows a great deal about pollination. And we're talking here about butterflies, bees, songbirds such as hummingbirds, and it's something that we sort of look at and probably ignore. And Casey, I'm glad you stayed with us because we've established that pollinating habitat or edge habitat or scrubby, brushy kind of habitat where we see a lot of flowering plants and it's maybe kind of a little difficult to walk through, there is value to this type of land. Do I have that correct?
As a matter of fact, kind of the old adage that I generally tell landowners is they need to kind of farm ugly a little bit. The scruffier generally is better for wildlife, all wildlife, including pollinators. In those weedy areas that are off in the corner somewhere, there's a lot of value in those in terms of wildlife habitat.
These habitats help our crops immensely. You talked about fruit trees and such. Now, it would only make sense to me, and I'm not a landowner, I am not a farmer, but if I were, I think I would want to have this a part of my agricultural plan. Do farmers have these, let's just call them hedgerows or linear habitat, the marginal areas of fields?
There's a lot of habitat out there that, we use that term habitat. There's a lot of areas out there that landowners may kind of ignore or not really recognize as habitat. And those linear areas that you talked about, field margins, just an odd area over there that maybe can't get to with a tractor or a mower, those areas are very, very critical for pollinators and insects that do pollination work. Landowners often have these areas established out of the way. They're already there. They're hedgerows. They're old field fence lines, an odd area of a field that they don't use. The greatest thing that they could do would be not to mow those areas or don't be as quick to mow those areas or disc those areas or plow those areas. Those would give the greatest benefit to pollinators in those types of areas.
It sounds to me like what you're saying is already in the earth, already in the soil, these plants, these seeds exist. And if you let them grow up, you'll be amazed at what comes to be, what blooms. I've heard someone say these are wildflowers you used to call weeds.
That's right. The weeds that we call weeds are typically the food source for these pollinators. They're already here. They're already established. The insects are familiar with them. And basically all we need to do is let them grow.
You can have these pollinator edge scruffy habitats, even if there is not a farm or a crop close by.
That's right. Most of these pollinators forage considerable distances anyway, but as a biological source, or in other words, this is a source for the ecosystem to produce these insects that benefit a lot of different aspects of wildlife, of the ecology of our surroundings. So just as from a biological standpoint, this is an ecological service. These areas can provide ecological services for the environment as a whole.
You take a pollinator habitat, and you could call it a pollinator. Well, I have a pollinator habitat in my front lawn. I've got these beautiful flowers, and they come up and they bloom in the spring. And after that, they're gone. That's not pollinator habitat, or is it? I understand it, that you need something that is going to bloom in spring, summer, and into fall.
Providing habitat is really a process that we would need to go through to really provide quality habitat. Now, we can all plant flowers, and sure, they may provide a short amount of a food source or a nesting site very briefly, but when we talk about pollinator habitat, we like to emphasize that it's a year-long, it's established in order to provide food and nesting sites and protection throughout the entire year. So we're talking about providing different types of vegetation or sites or areas that are protected from herbicides or pesticides, but we can provide a food source early in the year when bumblebee queens emerge from their hibernation, all the way up until late summer, early fall, when the bees typically either hibernate or die off or whatever from that point on.
You mentioned the word pesticide, and a great many people are in favor because they don't want insects interfering with their day. But pesticides in this realm of thinking as far as pollinators, good thing, bad thing? What's the balance there?
Pesticides, and when I say the term pesticides, I'm talking about herbicide and insecticide. So I'm just kind of lumping those two together. But, pesticides are a necessary product that we have to use in agriculture, we have to use for wildlife management, but there has to be a compromise in there somewhere where we use those responsibly and use the least damaging pesticides that we can. A lot of the products that are now being sold are actually labeled with the toxicity to bees on the label. That's relatively new and has started in the last 3 or 4 years with a lot of emphasis on bees. There's so many different formulations. I would encourage people to read the labels and look at the product and see if it's harmful to bees. As a general statement, most of the broad spectrum herbicides and pesticides are quite toxic to bees.
We're talking to biologist Casey Schrader. He's with the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and he's speaking to us from his office in Lexington about a type of habitat that is often overlooked for its role in the fabric of nature. Flower-rich areas, often overgrown, that are a virtual buffet to creatures that like to eat nectar and pollen. And Casey, you were talking about pesticides.
Pesticides really are the number one threat to pollinators, as a general statement. And those types of chemicals that are dusts or really strong concentrated liquids are the most toxic as a general rule. Granular herbicides and pesticides can be harmful, but they're typically not as harmful to bees or pollinators as some of the other dustable formulas.
But let me just ask the obvious question. If you had granular or the powdery types of pesticides, would they not more quickly blend in with the pollen itself? And if we had a bee land and walk around on a flowering plant, the bee would get both.
It's true. The dust and the liquids, the reason the dust is especially the most toxic to bees is because if you look at a bee is covered in tiny hairs, which is why they're so effective as pollinators. And when the dust gets in those hairs and then the bee cleans itself later on, it will inevitably ingest some of that dust. It will also carry that dust in the hairs back to its nest site or hive and then transfer that on to the larvae, which is doubly toxic. So as a rule, the granular things that are so large they can't get into the bee's hairs, those tend to be least toxic. But like you said, formulas and liquid can still also be toxic to bees, just as lethal. It's a really tricky thing to look at toxicity when you're dealing with pesticides.
What is nature going to do on its own? And that question can go a number of different ways. If we're talking about if man were not there and didn't plow up the land, it didn't strip it down to make golf courses or football fields, would everything on its own be in balance? And can you sort of answer that knowing that a lot of what your book is about and this radio show is about is sort of correcting some of the wrongs that man has done over the years?
You have to think of the ecologies of areas before man was here, what would have happened. And yes, I think there are what we as biologists call carrying capacities for every organism. Some we have artificially increased populations of certain species by things we've done. Others we have decreased the populations by land management practices that we've done. And I think there is a balance of all of these organisms simply by the effect that man's population here has increased to the point where we're artificially creating agriculture, creating crops and food to feed us. We also need to increase the populations of those pollinators and those insects that provide pollinating services for those crops. So yes, there probably would be a balance. I think that creating habitat, not only for pollinators, but for many species that you would utilize the same habitat, I think that's always a good thing.
This has been an interesting hour, and Casey, I appreciate you being here. Do me a favor, and we've got to get to a break, but I want to have you back on the show at some point. Anything new and exciting in the world of pollinator habitat, give us a call. Can you do that?
Sure can.
Just ahead, we will look at, I'll call it a behind-the-scenes look at spring. My name is Charlie Baglin, and you are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. You are listening to Kentucky Afield Radio. We've had an interesting hour talking about pollination and the insects and hummingbirds and butterflies and things that do it around our state, and that that provide us benefit that we may just not recognize or we overlook. And Casey Schrader is with the USDA and has been my guest. And for landowners or for people who raise crops or raise fruit trees or just love providing habitat for the creatures that live there, the wildlife, the rabbits and quail and the songbirds that come to visit. There are programs that are offered by the USDA that they could take advantage of. EQIP is one of them. Here, as spring approaches, Casey, what can a landowner or anybody interested in establishing this habitat do?
I would encourage anybody that wants to learn more or actually do practices to help pollinator habitat, I would encourage them to go to their local USDA service center in their local county there and ask for assistance and see what programs are available. Like you said, EQIP is a part of the Farm Bill that is currently having applications be accepted. So
EQIP, I'm sure, is an acronym. What's that stand for?
The EQIP is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which NRCS administers throughout Kentucky, throughout the U.S. It has some provisions in it for wildlife, to establish wildlife habitat, including pollinator habitat. So I would encourage anyone that's interested to go into the local USDA office and see if there's anything that we can assist them with.
For a lot of people in central Kentucky, that person would be you, right?
That's right. It would probably be the Charlie Farmer here in who services most of these counties in central Kentucky. I would go in Lexington, the local USDA service center there.
And so do you have regional offices? How's that work for anyone from Pikeville to Paducah? How is the NRCS scattered about?
Basically, there are field offices that service about anywhere from 5 to 7 counties. Some have 1 or 2, some have 3 or 4. They're lumped into different regions. I happen to be located in the state office, which services the entire state, but we have Farm Bill biologists that are located throughout the state of Kentucky that would be glad to assist in different areas and different regions of the state.
Talking about EQIP, now, how does that program work? Do you have to spend X to get X as a match?
Typically how that works is that landowners would apply and we would write them a conservation plan depending on what their goals were. Once they would establish, we have set costs already installed in the program that says if you'll do this practice, we will pay you this amount. And usually once the landowner or the participant goes out and installs that practice, we go out, certify that it's done correctly, and then we'll pay that landowner.
Is there an acreage minimum?
There's not an acreage minimum, but there are certain thresholds that may have to be met in terms of eligibility and that kind of thing. And some practices may not be as conducive to, say, the backyard as it would be to more of a participant that would own or manage more land.
At the CREP program, CREP.
Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. That is a kind of a sub-program, if you will, as the Conservation Reserve Program, which is a much more comprehensive program that allows landowners to install practices under a contract for 10 or 15 years, depending, to establish things like pollinator habitat or extra wildlife habitat or buffers or those types of practices that promote wildlife habitat. That program actually provides a rental payment each year of the contract to the landowner.
What is the best time of year for people to be thinking about this?
The best time of year to start thinking about what they're going to do is right now. In order to get a lot of these vegetative practices established, landowners should probably be thinking about what they're going to do before the growing season starts and getting those sites prepared for warmer weather and during the growing season.
What about for Mr. and Ms. Smith who have 2 kids and they live in the suburbs? What can they do in their backyard or around their home to make it just a little bit more pollinator friendly?
There are tons of great websites. NRCS service centers have tons of pollinator information for backyard enthusiasts that want to do pollinator habitat. I would encourage anybody that wants to learn more about pollinator habitat to go to either the NRCS website, and I think we have links there to also the Xerces Society, and that's spelled XERCES.org. I would also caution some of the listeners that there are a lot of commercial seed mixes and websites out there that promote pollinator habitat, but be very, very cautious on what you look at there because, as we said, some of these mixes and some of this so-called habitat enhancement mixes and backyard things are not providing resources for pollinators. They're actually just more aesthetically pleasing. They don't provide the food and nectar resources that most of these pollinators need.
One last question, Casey, before we let you go. Do you text and drive?
Never.
That's great. Casey, I sure appreciate you coming on from the USDA and NRCS and talking about pollinators with us.
Charlie, thanks for having me.
It's a very good show. What time is it? We have a minute. Maybe you already know this because you have seen the signs posted. But in recent news out of Frankfurt, boat motor horsepower restrictions have been lifted on 8 state-owned lakes. Previously, boaters couldn't operate a motor boat on a state-owned lake that was more than 10 horsepower. but now they can. Boaters can now use larger motors, but here's the deal. You have to run them at idle speed only. Anglers may continue to run the boats with smaller motors at any speed. Waters affected by this regulation include Bolts, Bullock Pen, Corinth Lakes in Grant County, Beaver Lake in Anderson County, Elmer Davis Lake in Owen County, Kincaid Lake in Pendleton County, Shanty Hollow Lake in Warren and Edmonson counties. Where else? Ballard County at Swan Lake. The new regulations lifting the horsepower restrictions received approval too late for inclusion in the 2015 Kentucky Fishing and Boating Guide. So that said, we're out of time. This is Charlie Baglin inviting you to join us in a week, and we will go inside, outdoors again, right here on Kentucky Afield Radio.